Thank you for that introduction. And Dave, we've been covering XDR back before we even called it XDR. We used to call it a cybersecurity platform. And we've been doing research for a number of years in this area. Now, you have some specific research that really does highlight the business value of XDR. So can you share that with everyone?
Yeah, I sure can, John. Earlier this summer, we set out to do our best of our ability quantify what the results would be for those people that were using an XDR approach to threat detection and response. So let me cover off a few of what those, at least the top qualitative and quantitative metrics are. First and foremost, those organizations using an XDR approach to threat detection and response experienced half the successful attacks as other organizations. So from a pure efficacy security posture approach, significant improvement here for those using an XDR approach. Those same organizations said that they ignored less than half the amount of security alerts that other organizations ignored. So probably also reflected in the less than half the successful attacks, but also increasing the amount of throughput that the team could handle as well, and frankly, filtering out a lot of the alerts there as well. And then super importantly, these organizations were twice as confident that they were able to keep up with the changing threat landscape as other organizations. That's really compelling because the top challenge or issue we hear from most security teams is they're really struggling to handle the complexity of modern attacks today and really to keep up there. So pretty compelling. Further, we saw that those organizations were experiencing sort of less overall daily stress on their security teams and generally felt that they could hold their own with threat detection and response as compared to those that weren't, many of which reported they were overwhelmed and felt like they were in firefight mode continuously. These organizations were stretched less thin. And we also saw that this drove other operational and security improvements, including reduced mean time to detection times, mean time to respond, and then better overall analyst throughput, which has been sort of mentioned earlier in some of the sessions. Then when we asked organizations outright, like, so if you had to replace these automated techniques with manual techniques, what would that cost you? And on average, and it spanned actually much higher than this, but on average, we saw that organizations felt like it would take 8 full-time equivalent people to replace the automation that an XDR approach to threat detection and response brought forward. So pretty compelling results there. Let's take that up a level, John. So if you were to think about at the highest level, if we're trying to rationalize or justify XDR from a business payoff standpoint, how would you describe that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave, and it really speaks to your metrics. So as a CISO, and I speak to a lot of CISOs, my job is to mitigate risk. And so I may be doing things like zero trust or network segmentation. I may be doing things like multi-factor authentication. And what I'm really trying to do is prevent as many attacks as I possibly can. Now, the corollary to prevention is detection and response. So being as efficient and effective as I can at detection and response is the business value. And the efficacy is really important here, Dave, because we are talking about protecting critical assets. So if I can detect an attack very, very quickly, and then respond to it based on the data, not based on guesswork, not based on blind spots, but based on the data, then I am protecting my critical business assets. And I can do that at the beginning of the kill chain, not when the emergency lights are blinking, Dave. So with that, I go right back to you, my friend Dave. What is the number one business value of XDR based on your thoughts and your research and your conversations with users?
So we talk to a lot of people about what the possible benefits are, and then try to back that up with hard research on finding out what the actuals are. And while oftentimes we get excited about the efficiency gains that get talked about here, and I think Leah said that we can sort of upgrade our tier 1 analysts to potentially operate like tier 2 or tier 3 analysts along the way. And that's really an efficiency play. And there's other efficiency plays around alert reductions and other areas. But the real story is better security. And it's the top line story for what XDR is all about. It's why I got excited about this, John. Like 2 years ago, when we first started seeing inklings that this could become something that's possible. And as the complexity of the threat landscape continues, it's the big problem to solve here. It's an efficacy issue. Lots of other approaches that we can take to efficiency. And I'm not saying that the efficiency is not important to what's happening here, but like in my mind, this is really about efficacy, and everything else is second to that. That said, the SIM. Let's go back to the SIM. A couple of statements were made earlier about I think somebody said if you're only using a SIM, or the weak points of a SIM, or other things. Hey, I'm a big proponent of SIM, John. I know you're a huge proponent of what you can do with your SIM. Organizations all over the world have invested deeply in SIM as a core to their organization. So if this is all possible with XDR, how does this rework, or how should people rethink about putting this together with their SIM, and how do they plug and play together?
That's a great question, Dave. So, and you can see I figured out my video too. Those who have a SIM typically have invested a lot into it. So they've trained their people, they've built their own correlation rules. Sometimes they're sharing content in a community, and they're using SIM effectively for operational processes. At the same time, Dave, SIM is complex, and it's not good at detecting unknown types of threats. So here's where XDR can do SIM a favor. XDR is instrumented to detect unknown threats, and it can produce high fidelity alerts with all of the data elements and then send them up to SIM. So that does two things, Dave. That streamlines your investigation, right? It can be a two-way, it actually does more than two things. It's a two-way binary communication back and forth to the XDR for things like quarantining systems, or shutting off a port in a firewall, or things like that. It also, and this is really key, it reduces the amount of data that you have to move to the SIM. And one of the things about SIM is it's expensive to use, and data gets lost in there. So it produces, once again, a degree of efficacy and efficiency with the SIM. Now, I don't think SIMs are going away anytime soon, but there's a way to make these two technologies cooperate very well. That's a win-win. So now I have a question back for you, Dave. So tell me, how will organizations, or how are you hearing organizations want to consume XDR?
Well, and this is super relevant to what you're just talking about on the SIM, right? So as organizations look at XDR, most organizations today already have a different, some number of controls in place. They may or may not, as we saw in the survey, have an EDR solution or some other detection and response solution in place. So many organizations are thinking, I need to do this in an incremental fashion. There may be a gap in either my current SOC stack that I'm looking at, or I may have some challenges with an existing security control that I want to swap out. But this is an overtime implementation cycle for most. One of the scariest things anybody gets to do in security is think about a full rip and replace strategy here, where I tear everything out and start over. And I think that's not what we're asking here. And XDR is uniquely suited to be able to go in, get immediate advantage by adding one or two of the sort of control points into the mix. And I know some of the trenders have been talking about some of the basics around endpoint and email, and then dialing in network data and dialing in cloud data over time. We see lots of orgs have gaps in cloud data specifically, so many orgs might want to start with cloud and incrementally add other control data, other signals over time. And the great news is it just gets better with time as the signal strength increases, the fidelity increases, the depth of understanding about threats and complex threats, even the low and slows over time, that just gets better as the solution gets built out over time. So I think that the big takeaway on that is this doesn't have to be a scary big implementation of like rip it all out and start over. XDR is something that you ought to be able to layer into your environment, gain immediate value, and then over a period of time, implement all the different moving parts that's there. All right, so what about EDR? So lots of orgs have EDR in place today, and so does this? Speaking of replacing, does this replace EDR?
You know, Dave, I think this is where we as security people need to take stock of what we do. So we're in the business of protecting our organizations. Unfortunately, we've gotten to a point where people are in the business of protecting endpoints, protecting clouds, protecting the network. The whole notion behind XDR is that the sum is, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So when you ask me, will people replace EDR? My response is absolutely they will. And the reason they'll do that is because right now they're manually gluing together what EDR tells them with what the network says, with what threat intelligence says, with what the SIM says. XDR is going to do that for you. And the beauty of XDR, and this is really where I think the winners and losers will be drawn, is it's about the analytics and it's about the automation. So the analytics are, now I can take signals from multiple controls and I can build analytics on top of them. And then I can put them into like a MITRE attack framework and understand the life cycle of an attack, not just one discrete signal. And then, because it's wired into the controls, I have much more flexible automation actions. Now, clearly we do some of that with SOAR, at least in larger companies. And we'll still do that with SOAR, but now we have some more options and we have maybe a single interface rather than talking to the endpoint, the firewall, the cloud workload, things like that. So I do think people will replace EDR. But back at you, Dave, another question. What's the role of MDR or managed services here? Because we definitely see a lot of interest in services. We see a skill shortage. So how do MDR and XDR play together?
Yeah, that rolls in, and our data showed us that too. So much like the survey data that we saw here, we saw almost half the organizations were already using a managed detection and response service in their organizations today. Most wanted to acquire that service from the same vendor that provides their detection and response technology. So I think it's terrific that organizations like Trend Micro are providing those combined services together. And making the managed detection and response services built in to the XDR solution set. Many had been using EDR solutions in the past, and many of the MDR providers had assembled their own XDR stack. And so I think the good news here is this simplifies the stack for the MDR provider. It simplifies the stack for the acquiring organization for the MDR services, and it creates a common communication mechanism for both organizations to use to explore, understand, and report what's happening there. So I'm glad you brought that up, John, because MDR it's part of most every organization's either current world or they have a plan to get there. So let's wrap up and just summarize here. So the good news is we get some hard data that says, yep, there's real value here. The top line of that real value is around efficacy. We know that there are efficiency gains as well. We're starting to learn about what that implementation process looks like, and it feels like it's a very tolerable, manageable implementation process along the way. And I remain super bullish on the benefits of what's happening here.
And Dave, we're just getting started. So XDR solutions will improve and become more effective, more efficient, all goodness for protecting our business assets. So with that, thanks so much for listening today. I'm glad I figured out my camera. And back to you, Rick and Leah.